You're listening to The Fan Marillion, an unofficial companion podcast for the Amazon Prime series, The Rings of Power. I'm your host, Glorfindoll, reacting to the show each week and trying to figure out what in the Valar is going on. This time, we're covering The Rings of Power Episode 4, The Great Wave. So if you haven't watched it yet, turn back now, because there's going to be a Númenórean fleet's worth of spoilers. So what were the highlights on Tolkien's social media this week? For one, Neil Gaiman is still not working on Rings of Power. Some key members of the cast presented at the Emmys. It was nice to see them so clean and freshly pressed, and in Nori's case, human-sized. And finally, Ismael Cruz Cordova was on Jimmy Kimmel Live. And apparently, the press kits for Rings of Power give you show-branded Kit Kat bars, which are, and I cannot stress this enough, parallelograms, not circles. You could have done the same thing with the butt of a Hershey Kiss and made it a ring. Hershey owns both. No, Jeff Bezos says, swinging in on a tree vine, I need chocolate wafered logs. So I asked my producer when she shared that with me, were there at least 9 in the package? She says, there are 8. So what happened on Rings of Power this week? Why am I wondering what in the Valar is going on here? Let's start with the Harfoots. Now with Gandalf pushing the Brandyfoot cart, the injured Brandyfoot family should be able to stay with the Harfoot caravan. And we can assume they're caravanning along, because they don't appear this episode. I complained about the Harfoot plot taking time away from Númenor just last week, and I got the reprieve that I asked for. So cool. You'd think that would help me. But somehow, it didn't help. Because the showrunners filled that gap with more shite, like Elendil's daughter and Al-Farazon's son, dating. For some reason. They filled it with Theo, making horror movie level mistakes that make you go, oh Christ. What else? We got Galadriel, despite being thousands of years old at this point, needing to be taught problem solving and basic social cues by the Aragorn that Jeff Bezos bought on Wish. We got Celebrimbor, uncovering a dwarvish state secret completely by accident. Celebrimbor and his tomfoolery. There was so much to hate this episode. I am still shaking my head. I've been trying to write these podcast notes for 12 hours, folks, and I am just as puzzled as I was at 1 a.m. That's not fair. I don't hate this episode. Bad pizza is still pizza. And at the end of the day, this beautiful billion-dollar show based on the stories I fell in love with as a child is still exactly that. But much of this week's Ring of Power episode left me puzzled and frustrated. Those are the words. Not angry, but puzzled and alarmed. I rate this episode 3 glasses of wine. That's out of 5, folks. That is 2 refills after the first glass in a single hour. My worst rating so far. This was the first episode where I finally started to worry. I mean, actually worry. Episode 4 out of 8. We are halfway through the season now. And what do we have? Let's recap together. I will praise what I can, where I can, but I have lots of questions. We open in Númenor. The Queen Regent has a vision of the kingdom's watery destruction, which is very well executed foreshadowing. And it's some pretty moody, broody mood setting. I greatly enjoyed that. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that the elves were masters of the Palantir long before these great seeing 8-balls were gifted to the humans. I especially enjoyed Al-Farazon working the crowds. I wonder if that skill will come into play later. But also, laced with anti-elvish sentiment, Like we see at the beginning of this episode, I wonder what kind of threat he could pose if Muriel chooses to rebuild the alliance with elves. That wouldn't bode well for Queen Regent Muriel. Wouldn't that be nice? For a juxtaposition for the story at the end of the season. Oh, it happened this episode. Okay, exactly 1 hour in. We've got a last alliance. But don't forget, we have Galadriel, political mastermind and expert leader in Numenor. Oh, I can accept some headstrong moments and a dash of impulsiveness with an impassioned Galadriel, because she needs room to grow into the wise lady of the realm we'll meet in The Lord of the Rings in 3,000 years. And I love that she has a fierce streak and is suspicious of a peace too easily won. That tracks. That all tracks with her personality and her penchant for critical thinking. Absolutely. And would she likely be very adept at fighting? You bet. It all jives. It all almost jives. But I cannot buy into how much of a meat-headed horse girl the showrunners are leaning on with Galadriel's scripts. And I know a meat-headed horse girl when I see one. I went to private school. Halbrand coaching her on teamwork? Bitch, she's the army commander. That job is literally managing teams. And as a member of royal bloodlines herself, being House Finarfin and linked to the infamous House of Fëanor, she has been dealing with politics and power plays her whole life. She was there when the Númenóreans got this island. But actual human baby Halbrand, who came from the pigsties of Mordor villages and simply had an ancestor who rallied them. That's his claim to fame. Yes, that Halbrand is the better tactician. I'm sorry. Making a woman powerful by simply putting a sword in her hand and a fire in her heart is peak 90s feminism. She's not a teenage Joan of Arc on a mission from a voice in her head. She's Galadriel, and very much does not have hamburger meat for a brain. She would have approached anything that's happened on Numenor so far with a modicum of tact and intelligence, especially given that she needs these people, as Halbrand has to remind her. Like, what? Also, when I was editing my notes for this podcast, most of that job was just going through my notes and deleting the word literally in all caps when it appeared every sentence. That's when you know I'm upset. I emphasize the literality of my thoughts and feelings as though you wouldn't believe their nature otherwise. And because there aren't enough characters in Numenor yet, even more exit the clown car this episode as we meet Alfarazon's son, and then re-emphasize that Elendil's daughter will have speaking lines and scenes of her own. Thanks for that. Because the politics of Numenor weren't already rushed and watered down due to limited time and an overwhelming scope of things to cover. Let's get a teenage romance going with two characters who will never matter. And speaking of Game of Thrones levels of rushing, already in Season 1, Episode 4, like I said earlier, we have a last alliance. That was easy. I know we saw some cult leaders in the original trailer, so sure, this alliance will have its challenges, but I just am struggling to accept that Númenórean leadership was so easily persuaded by tactless Galadriel, as hopeless as she was, to provide aid. Especially given the severity of the anti-elf sentiment the previous episodes went out of their way to demonstrate, and which the beginning of this episode re-emphasized. How was she persuaded, you ask? Not by a few passionate sentences from Galadriel. No. After all, Lauren Boebert likes to give passionate speeches in Congress too. Passionate speeches are cheap. Au contraire. Queen Regent Muriel is supporting the last alliance because, are you ready? Some tree petals fell down in a gust of wind. To recap, this Queen Regent has never seen evidence of a Valar, but she's making kingdom-altering decisions against her own people's will a generations-long will to run their kingdom as human influence only, and in the face of her father being forcibly removed for acting similarly, she's doing this based on complete superstition of tree petals falling when the Valar are sad. Y'all ever heard of climate change? Trees switch their shit up all the time. Is reading tree petals in the air the equivalent of reading tea leaves at the bottom of a mug? I'm hard-pressed to believe the Queen Regent's brain is that full of hamburger either. Why are these powerful women so stupid this episode? It's all too easy and unnuanced, and I just expected... I don't know what I expect. A modicum of nuance, you know? She framed it as helping other humans on the mainland, but Numenor's whole claim to fame on this show is that they're better humans than the ones who sided with Morgoth. So, like, mainland humans made their bed and should lie in it, for all Numenor cares. They closed their borders several generations ago and clearly don't care. I'm not arguing, for the record, I'm not arguing that the show is going against the lore. I'm arguing that the show can't even be consistent from episode to episode. But somehow, a few well-delivered lines in the throne room by our Queen Regent changed their minds, and now they want to send sailors. I have a migraine. Modern television writers feel like if there's not a decision or action of some kind every 2 minutes that their viewers will revolt. But like when shit just happens, one stupidity right after another without any room to breathe, I mean, how can this be the model? How? I've had more complex thoughts about which type of cereal to buy. I don't blame anyone but the screenplay writers for thinking that such a high-budget show requires a proportionally stupid screenplay in order to broaden its reach, when instead it could just lean into its own complexity and engage its viewers. And it's not even like they would have to establish this precedent. They're out there trying to be like Game of Thrones while forgetting that Game of Thrones got where it rose to because its first few seasons were remarkably complex and challenging. That was new to viewers, and they loved it. Viewers turned on them when they abandoned that strategy, in fact. Am I overreacting because of my initial emotional investment? When I say join the conversation on my socials at the end of my episodes, guys, I mean it. Please talk me down. Tell me what you think on my Famnarillion socials, Ring Fam. All right, I'm taking a lore break. So Glorfindoll, talk to us about the politics of these human kingdoms from the canon. Thank you for asking, random elf guard number 3. Rings of Power tells us that Numenorians, or the Edain, as Alfarazan called them this week, love that the showrunners are using some words and references from the Silmarillion that I didn't think they could. Nicely done, gents. So anyway, the Edain are so called because they fought alongside the Valar and the elves against the evil of Morgoth at the War of Wrath. As a reward, Numenorians got the island. That has been established on Rings of Power, and I've also discussed it on this podcast. But when it comes to the Numenorians' relationships with their brothers from another mother, the men of the main continent, things are quite messy in the Second Age. Numenorians, being excellent shipwrights, head to Middle-earth and meet these societies and establish some ports. Right around where Gondor and Arnor end up on your Middle-earth maps, actually. At first, these explorers simply trade and teach and share technologies and language with the, shall we say, lesser developed societies. But over time, and many visits, the Middle-earthers start to treat these advanced travelers from across the sea like kings, maybe even godlike figures. And, in a tale as old as time, the explorers twist into conquistadors. Trade and teachings morph into sackings and fiefdoms and slave labors. Very Germanic and probably relatable in any human culture. It's a very human story. Most of Tolkien's tales are more human than they are local, which is why his work maintains such long-living global reach. So back to the Númenóreans. What happens to them next? Well, they're lording over the Middle-earth men, and people that proudly and self-assuredly doing that to people wouldn't hesitate to also alienate their quote-unquote elven betters, especially, and this is how it comes back to this episode, especially when people like Galadriel in Rings of Power simply can't help themselves, reminding the people of Númenor that they indeed have betters, and those betters are I. The Númenóreans' resistance to elves and their eventual banishment from Númenor is a complicated but very interesting story that I hope the showrunners leave enough space to lean into and really examine. However, I fear that at the rate we're going, this sentiment will get about as much nuance as yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and we'll be left with lots of questions. Down in the Southlands, aka future Mordor, as was revealed last week, we have Arondir meeting the new mysterious Adar. Adar, in only 5 minutes on screen, swiftly became the most engaging element of the show to date. We got a few answers, such as, this is definitely not Sauron. He is indeed an elf, as I predicted, but one who follows Sauron. Adar seems to have aspirations for godhood, or some definition of it that we're not privy to. His agreement with Sauron and his specific goals of working with him are not yet revealed. For now, we know Adar is seeking the sword hilt of black magic now in Theo's possession. And so, Adar's mysteries continue. Mysteries like, why does he feel so close to these orcs? So close as to shed a tear for even a single orc death. And a devotion enough to spare their suffering with euthanasia. He says Arondir believes lies about the world. What are the lies he alludes to? I'm wondering if Adar knows what Saruman revealed to viewers in The Fellowship of the Ring. The dark truth about the origins of orcs. That in the beginning of the First Age, Morgoth abducted and tortured and corrupted elves, and that through a rigorous breeding program, Morgoth created the orcs we know today. Perhaps Adar feels pity and a connection of kindred elfin souls for these long-lost elves. I'd love to see that explored. I've seen on the web even the theory that Adar is one of them, maybe the first, from whom others were bred and corrupted further. Only time will tell, because the episode leaves us yearning for more. This was expertly done. This was one of the only moments of light in Rings of Power Episode 4, so congratulations, Joseph Mawley. Well played, and welcome to Season 1. This week, we also learned that the Southland men, descended from Morgoth's sworn bannermen, are indeed still untrustworthy. Just like the leader of the elf watchtower garrison said. I can't believe that racist elf captain was right after all. These Southlander men are tricky-dicky. Arondir, watch out for your girl. I don't like where these mortal Mordor swine are heading. It turns out that one old man in Bronwyn's village in particular knows exactly how evil that sword hilt was and was enthusiastically holding on to it in his root cellar for Sauron's return. Imagine, Sauron needs to stop off at this man's root cellar before he conquers the continent. What a twist. Racist elves always know better, I guess. What an interesting and unintended takeaway from this episode. And you know what else is hard to swallow? Because Arondir didn't listen to that garrison captain about his dubiously reformed humans, and went off with Bronwyn anyway, it's probably what got them all killed. And as I write this emotional turn of events, my producer is playing the most passionate pianoforte behind me, so apropos. Arondir, your decisions are bad, and you should feel bad. Oh, and get this. This had me confused for the rest of the episode. The humans all packed up their village at the end of last week to become refugees at the watchtower, right? Okay, simple. But as we learned this week, they forgot to pack food. What? So someone has to go back to get food. What is this writing, Amazon? What is going on? I've read fan fiction dialogue for free that felt stronger than this. They forgot to pack food, everyone. That was the plot of this episode. Speaking of Theo, that stooped, gangle preteen looking ever agape and who's really proud of his chin fuzz, I was cringing during that tavern sequence. His choices are horror movie levels of bad. Yes, let's do the absolute most dangerous thing possible. When we already have a cart full of food that we could bring back, let's take unnecessary risks because we are teenage boys with death wishes. I can't believe he's still alive, and I'm pretty annoyed by it. Just die. Just give up the hilt to Adar's minions and free Bronwyn of her burden. Let her and Arondir replace you with a better half-elven model. I loved Arondir's slow-motion archery as he rescues the family and heads to the clearing, but I'm going to miss his detailed tree armor, which was taken from him in Adar's slave pit. Now Arondir's just kind of in his Victorian underwear skivvies, kind of like Galadriel was for 2 whole episodes. So many elf dressing gowns. The costume department must have been panicking with that direction. You should put them in dressing gowns. It's $1 billion show, though. I don't know. Should we design some costumes? No. Dressing gowns. For 3 episodes. It'll be great. And last, but certainly not least, this week we returned to Eregion to check in on the Great Forge. Any progress? Why, yes. The dwarves are building a beautiful CGI forge based on Celebrimbor's designs. Elrond's pitch to bring in cheap, quick dwarf labor was successful for some reason. We really don't know why the dwarves accepted this proposal, especially in the face of what we learned this week with their new dig in the priceless Mithril mine. In the face of this new... I can't, you guys. In the face of this new wealth that they just dug up, what is in it for them? We have no idea why they're doing this, and it's starting to affect my ability to enjoy even this, my favorite plotline of the show. Well, at least it was before Adar and his perfect practical effects orcs came into my life. Khazad-dûm, I repeat, why are you building the Eregion elves' new forge for them? I literally require one reason. See, this is why Netflix's strategy of dropping a whole season at once is so successful. It's possible the Rings of Power showrunners will explain this stupid mystery by the end of the season, but I'm going to spend the next 4 weeks dwelling on it and being completely annoyed, even if it is eventually answered. The psychological damage to my enjoyment will already be done. Okay, so the dwarves are diligently at work. Celebrimbor got exactly what he asked for. Great. And cue anxious Uncle Brimbor experiencing the vapors. Oh, God. Why? What's wrong, Kelly? Why so nervous and preoccupied with Durin, a dwarf you just met and don't know very well? Well, get this. Are you ready? Durin's busy. Imagine the heir to a throne of a whole ass kingdom is too busy to hang. Suspicious, he says. Durin is either avoiding me or he's hiding something. You're very silly and paranoid, Celebrimbor, I say to myself. But then, 10 minutes later, it turns out he was right. This is exactly how Elrond uncovers that the dwarf leaders are hiding their new mithril deposit from their neighbors. Okay, first of all, good on them. I'd do the same thing, hiding my mithril deposit from my neighbor. That's an ace in the hole. Yeah, I would hide it. Second, the elves are so mad about it. When you established in episode 2 that there are no pre-existing political relations in place between your two races, so why should they be updating you on their mithril dig? It's not strange behavior at all. Elrond is so butthurt by this, and Celebrimbor is like, we've had a contract for 5 minutes. Why aren't they coming to brunch and telling me their life story? What even is this writing? But I digress. As much as Uncle Brimby vexed me to drink this episode, I tell you, Khazad-dûm is still great. Like I said, like I reminded myself, pizza is still pizza, even bad pizza. The folks who complained about Durin's Bane happening a few thousand years too early, this is a lore change I'm grateful for. I'll acknowledge, I did get the Arkenstone prediction wrong a few weeks ago. We now know that the secret treasure the dwarves are low-key hiding was the discovery of mithril veins in a deep mine shaft. This is a very fun aspect to the Rings of Power, because I wasn't expecting to see a piece of dwarven history so old as mithril refining. Very cool. And I finally got to see and hear Disa singing to the stones. Fun fact, that song is on Bear McCreary's soundtrack for the show, and Disa's actress, Sophia Nomvete, is credited as the singer. That was really her. With the moody instrumentation and the choir behind her, I had goosebumps. What a talent. And lastly, we learned some more family history from Elrond. Elrond has inarguably the most complex, important, and far-reaching family history of any character in the lore, and I'm excited that Rings of Power is going there. But now that they are going there, let's make sure you're keeping track and give you a little more context to really soak it in. Elrond has a close family member who is deeply linked to the island kingdom of Numenor. That is his brother, Elros. Last week on Rings of Power Episode 3, we saw Elrond on a tapestry in Numenor's Hall of Lore. We learned there that this Hall of Lore was actually assembled, as Galadriel says in her own words, by Elros himself. And then she goes on to explain her friendship with that man's brother. Staring up at this tapestry of two brothers, we see Robert Aramayo's familiar goblin face. What's the story there? The story is that Elrond's brother Elros actually founded the island kingdom of Numenor. Founded the whole thing. What? Yeah. To explain how, we have to go back into his lineage, which is just as colorful. Some of the biggest tales of the First Age are in his direct lineage, including the only 2 elf with human marriages on record. Yeah, both of them. Elrond and Elros have 2 human grandfathers, one on either side. When shit went down at the end of the First Age and the continent was broken, Elrond and his brother were allowed to make a choice, given their muddied bloodlines. The first choice was to remain amongst the immortal elves as one of them. Elrond chose this. The second choice was to stay, grow old with the mortal men, give up the elven home of Valinor, choose mortality. Elros chose this. With that choice, Elros founded Numenor and became its first king and delivered elven bloodlines even deeper into the Numenorian aristocracy. With the knowledge of losing his brother to the mortality of men, It's all the more poignant that thousands of years later, Elrond's own daughter will make the same choice his brother did and leave him for mortal life. Clearly, the mortality bug is infectious in his family. And of course, Elrond shared touching details about his father on this week's Rings of Power. His father, he called the Mariner, is the famous elf who sailed to Valinor to request intervention from the godlike figures the Valar, of whom Morgoth was one. His famous father's name is Elendil. You might recognize that name from Fellowship of the Ring, because Galadriel gifted to Frodo the light of Elendil, our most beloved star. But Glorfindoll, Elrond's father was an elf or a star? Yes. Just yes. Elendil, on the shores of forbidden Valinor, threw himself down and begged the Valar to handle their fucking god business and get a hold of their guy. And the Valar were like, who, us? Clean our house? What, he's been ravaging your people and lands for a millennial and you want it to stop? I suppose we can look up from our naked singing in the glades and feasts in our crystal halls and general water sprite lifestyle for a single day and go save your world. We could have done this at any point, by the way, but because you risked your life to come here and ask, Elendil will do it. So, it's thanks to Elrond's father that the War of Wrath happened at all, and that Morgoth was finally imprisoned. What a deeply disturbing legendarium. But that's usually the case with gods and human mythos. They're written much like humans, because that's all we understand. And the Silmarillion's mythos is no different. Elendil now lives with the stars, and his wife, Elrond's mother, even turned into a bird for a while as she fled destruction while bearing the Silmaril. That's right, I said Elrond's mother turned into a fucking bird. That's a story for another day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you, Elrond's family is the singular magic genetic line of craziness in all of Middle-earth. Elrond's family is that family in the cul-de-sac that you don't want to ever get involved with because the cops are there every weekend. And they are total Housewives of Beverly Hills level of bonkers. But also everyone's obsessed with them. Elrond doesn't get enough credit for turning out so goddamn normal. Elrond is chill as fuck in the Third Age, which is an accomplishment all on its own given his family history. Managing a nice ravine city and reading moon runes to traveling dwarves and advising people with his wise counsel but ultimately not engaging in mischief. Great work, lad. You did it. And you didn't even turn into a fucking bird. I want to go back to Elrond and Celebrimbor in episode 4 of Rings of Power for a minute, though, and call out what I can no longer hold inside. Yes, I was holding some things inside. Yeah. In the texts, expert craftsman Celebrimbor is the one who eagerly works with the dwarves and develops friendships with them, which would make sense, being an expert craftsman. It feels like the showrunners shifted that relationship to Elrond just to give Elrond something to do before he established Imladris and fights in the Last Alliance. But it was done without any balance because now Celebrimbor doesn't have anything to do except study rolled-up plans and quake anxiously at the dinner table about how Durin won't talk to him. These characterization changes are starting to rattle me, because I thought surely it must have had a suitable trade-off somewhere. But considering we still don't know Celebrimbor, I'm growing concerned. You'd think with a whole hour per week, that would be enough to start getting to know our characters. But unfortunately, as I said, we are halfway through this season now, with little more than caricatures and awkward exchanges between most of our characters. I don't feel like I know most anyone yet, And the ones I have gotten to know, like Galadriel and Halbrand and Nori, I mostly wish I hadn't. And people like Elrond, I'm getting to know, but incorrectly. He has Celebrimbor's social backstory and is working overtime to justify it to the audience, like, oh, I stumbled upon him being attacked by trolls in the woods and I rescued him and we became friends for life, despite not really bonding on any shared hobbies like craftsmanship. Who do I know who's interested in craftsmanship? Celebrimbor. Oh, but you don't know him. It's becoming wine-inducing. I supported a lot of these changes up front because I thought they would reveal themselves as positive moves later. I came into this with such an open mind, and I still have one, but it's being tested here at the show's midpoint. And I resent that. So here I am, mid-season. I'm rating episodes 3 glasses of wine already. This does not bode well for 4.5 more seasons. I need this to start making sense, being thoughtful, and helping my trust pay off. Now, before I let this week's episode go, and I really do want to let it go, I want to touch on something that the internet lore masters continue to ask without a hint of irony. They ask, where's Celeborn, her husband, and Celebrian, her daughter? From what I gather, they're mad because Galadriel is still seemingly single and child-free, which is a cardinal sin to be without family obligations, I suppose. I don't know. I didn't think about it much because it's kind of nice to, for once in a Tolkien story, for a woman to have greater significance than just an entry on a family tree for the purpose of producing even more sons for the next chapter of text. You might remember Galadriel's silvery husband Celeborn from the Fellowship of the Ring, played by the most evocative Kiwi, Martin Sokar. So where's he? For the male viewers much desire to speak with him. Well, as we've established over and over and over again, but we will retread. The canon timeline doesn't matter for Rings of Power. The canon timeline doesn't matter. She doesn't have to be married right now if it doesn't benefit the story being told. And it literally doesn't matter. Lore boys. Oh, I love that. I'm going to call them lore boys now. Lore boys will complain about the dumbest minutia and say, the show is ruined because they mispronounced that one line of Quenya, and so-and-so's hair is a different color, and Gandalf is 1,000 years too early, even though it doesn't change his purpose at all, which is to help Middle-earth fight Sauron. So it's the same story regardless, but I'm going to make 5 consecutive Facebook posts about how I refuse to watch on principle alone. Okay, Brayden, thank you for your feedback. Look, I know what the showrunners are doing here vis-a-vis Celeborn. Follow me. We have a young Galadriel in search of fulfillment, floundering, angry. She is the quintessential emotionally closed-off, highfalutin city girl heading to a small town to rebuild an inn and fight some orcs, but who finds love along the way. We've got 5 seasons to work with here. Celeborn is absolutely coming later, because as our main character, a single woman won't stay single for long. That's just TV law, folks. Celeborn's coming. Mark my words. I don't know anything. I have no insider information. I haven't seen any announcements. I'm just using my eyes and my head. That's my expertise. I will buy you a Coke if Celeborn doesn't show up next season to start annoying and flustering our heroine so that by season 5, he can sweep her off her feet. And because Elrond canonically marries their daughter, we can safely assume Elrond will remain a bachelor for the full run of the show. Now, I know I sound like I disapprove, but it's all in good fun. I actually am very on board with this timeline change for our lead female. It'll be more interesting than the canonical alternative, which would have Galadriel and Celeborn already 1,000 years plus deep into their marriage. Screenwriting is about showing development and change, which is a challenge when your source characters are immortal, rarely changing elves. And by the way, according to Google, Martin Soka is 56 years old. So in entertainment, that's just the right age to play the love interest for our young heroine. Come on, let's just bring him back. It's only been 20 years since Fellowship. It'll make perfect sense. He'd still look younger than Celebrimbor. All right, I'll get off that horse eventually. And one last thing I want to touch on as a last homage. This is me projecting because I didn't actually see too much on this during the online chatter this week. However, the absence of chatter on this topic was infuriating. Where is the upheaval over our loss of Watchtower Elf number 2? I dubbed him the sarcastic elf. Oh, did you fetch some water? Some nice cool water? Over there by the sexy human, we thirsty? I love that guy. He was hysterical. And then the show killed him immediately last week. Now the only fun characters are the Harfoots. Fuck. R.I.P. Arondir's unnamed friend. We barely knew ye. We'll talk all about where things go in Middle-earth from here and how I feel about them on the next episode of The Fan Marillion. Let's start closing this down with the trivia question. We saw Celebrimbor's anxiety over his future this episode. Why might Celebrimbor feel cursed? Other than his future, is there something in his past that might contribute to these feelings of profound dread? The answer is yes. Celebrimbor came into this world already cursed, which could be why he will play such a pivotal role in the future activities on the Rings of Power. This curse comes from his grandfather, Fëanor. You heard that name in episode 1. Celebrimbor keeps Fëanor's treasured crafting hammer on display. I often refer to the history of elven kinslaying on this podcast, and I do so because it launched most everything that happens in the first age of Valinor and Middle-earth. I won't go into the history of that today because that's its own podcast episode, perhaps after Rings of Power ends. But just briefly, the fruits of Fëanor's sins were passed on to his sons to bear. Precious few of those sons lived long enough to have their own family. As Fëanor's only grandson and the last of his house, the curse of Fëanor will come to a close with Celebrimbor. Big thank you to everyone who joined on Thursday for Fan Marillion's Tolkien Trivia launch on Twitch TV. Join us on Twitch every Thursday before the episode at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We'll pre-game together and help you stay awake for the Rings of Power episode, which Where I Am gets released at midnight. To put it on your calendar and see instructions for joining, find next week's event on our Facebook page. Next week's trivia theme will be Food and Music of Middle-earth. And now for our vocab word. On this week's Rings of Power episode, Elrond and Durin helped me out. They broke down the Elvish Sindarin word mithril, meaning gray glitter. This becomes the common term for the highly treasured ore that is found only in the mines of Moria. Recall that Gandalf recollected in the Fellowship of the Ring that the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. The mithril was why. The desire to maximize output of this most rare and strong and light and beautiful ore. But what lies in the deep bowels of that mine? And could what's slumbering down there even have contributed to the gradual development of these changes to the rock? We'll have lots of questions about it as this season of Rings of Power unfolds. I'm Glorfindoll, and this was my show. I welcome your opinion, but remember, I'm not the whole fandom. I'm just a fan. Join the conversation at Fan Marillion on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and now Twitch TV. Or, for flaming that's too spicy for socials, send me an email at fanmarillion@gmail.com so that I can ignore it. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
This has been an Opus Nox Media production. Produced and edited by Ali Bachman. For more information on Opus Nox Media, please visit opusnoxmedia.com.